It's spring and it's the beginning of Milky Way season. I'm on location in rural Canada and I'm going to teach you to shoot the Milky Way. Hello everyone and welcome to my latest video. I'm here doing one of the things I love the best, and that's shooting Milky Ways. First, let's talk about what you're going to need. You're going to need a headlamp or some kind of means to see in the dark. You're going to need a camera, preferably one with interchangeable lenses. Full frame is a little bit better than a crop sensor camera. You're going to need a lens. You're going to need a wide, fast lens, and with that I mean you need a lens of 24 millimeters or maybe 28 millimeters or wider. So you want 28, 24, 20, 18, 16, 14 millimeters. Wider is better as it will allow you to take longer exposures without the star streaking. We'll be talking about that later. You also need a fast lens. You want a lens of f2.8 preferably or faster. f2, this happens to be a Sigma Art Series 20 millimeter 1.4 lens. And a 1.4 lens lets in 4 times more light than an f2.8 lens. And you're also going to need a tripod because we're going to be taking long exposures. If you don't own a fast wide lens, I can give you an easy recommendation for your first lens if you're going to go out and buy one. I'd recommend the Rokinon 14mm 2.8 lens. It's a manual focus lens, so it's maybe less useful during the daytime, but for nighttime photography, it's plenty sharp, and manual focus is how we shoot astrophotography and Milky Way photography anyway, so that's not an impediment. Now let's talk about the conditions you need. First, you need no moon. The moon will wash away your Milky Way. There are plenty of websites and apps that will allow you to find out what the moon phase is. You can shoot around new moon or right before or right after if the moon has just set or the moon hasn't risen yet. Let's talk about the time of year. Spring to fall is what's called Milky Way season. It's not that the Milky Way isn't visible during the winter, it's that from the spring to the fall is when the best part of the Milky Way, the core of the Milky Way, is visible above the horizon and makes for best photography. You also need a clear sky. You can have a few clouds going through your frame, and actually it won't ruin your Milky Way shot necessarily to have a cloud or two in there, but for the most part you want a clear night. Now the next condition is having a dark sky. There are 2 types of light pollution. The first type of light pollution is macro or broad scale or city scale light pollution. This is the light pollution that comes from cities and towns and from man-made lights. You can find light pollution maps online like lightpollutionmap.info that will show you light pollution on a broad scale and will give you hints as to in which direction to drive or go to get away from this light pollution. Then there's smaller scale light pollution, right at the site where you want to take your photo. House lights and street lights are the common culprits here. You want to try to get away from those. You want to get away from this light pollution for your scene to be dark and for the skies to be dark. There are also tools that you can use for planning your Milky Way shots. One of my favorites is PhotoPills. PhotoPills is an app that allows you to know the position of the Milky Way at any given time, as well as understand sunset, sunrise times, moon phases, and so on. Next, you should find a subject for your Milky Way. The Milky Way is in the south. In the spring, it's in the southeast, midsummer in south, southwest by September and October. You should find a subject that faces south, so when you're looking towards the Milky Way, the subject will be in front of the Milky Way or below the Milky Way. Usually rustic subjects work well for Milky Way shots. This would be an old car, an old barn, a path, an old building. A lake and its reflection when it's not windy is also a great subject to put in your Milky Way photo. It's best to look for compositions during the daytime. If you're at night looking for compositions and you're away from any source of light and light pollution, it's not possible to see interesting things to put in a Milky Way photo. Now it's time to look at settings. Now there's a few things we can do with our camera even before we leave the house. I like to turn my brightness down. On Canon cameras, the brightness of the back LCD is on a 7-point scale. I like to turn it down to 2. If you leave it bright, your images will look really bright and you'll think you'll have them well exposed even if you're underexposed. Putting your brightness down will give you a much more realistic view of what your exposure looks like. Also, I recommend putting your white balance in manual and putting it at something like 3800 Kelvin. You can leave it in automatic if you're shooting in RAW and adjust it later, but if you're taking multiple exposures, your white balance may change between exposures and make it harder to blend photos together. I also recommend putting the 2-second timer on your camera or bringing a shutter release. Pressing the shutter button on long exposures risks making your images blurry and shaking the camera. Okay, let's talk about settings. First thing I recommend strongly is shoot in RAW. Your camera will have more dynamic range and you'll better be able to process your photos if they were shot in RAW. I recommend shooting your lens wide open, that is at its widest aperture. We're going to be shooting in the dark. You need all the light you can get, so shoot your lens wide open. As for your ISO, Milky Way photos are shot at very high ISOs. If you have a full frame camera, you want to be shooting your ISO between 3200 and 6400 to start off, and you can experiment using those. If you're shooting a crop sensor camera, probably between 1600 and 3200 is best. The next part is the exposure length. Now here we're trying to balance two things. It's a very dark scene, so shooting longer exposures collects more light. The problem is the Milky Way moves, and as it moves, your stars will streak if your exposures are too long. A handy rule has been developed to try to calculate what the maximum exposure length you can shoot without streaking your stars is, and it's called the 500 rule. On a full frame camera, take 500, divide it by your focal length, and it will give you the number of seconds that you can shoot without your stars streaking. So for me, I have a 20mm lens. 500 divided by 20 gives me 25, so 25 seconds is the longest I can shoot. Now with higher megapixel modern cameras, if you pixel peep a lot and look into the details, even at 25 seconds I will get some streaking, so I will often shoot my lens at 15 or 20 seconds. For crop sensor cameras, they effectively have more magnification, and hence you can't shoot as long before the stars will streak. You should use the rule of 300. So for a 20mm lens, 300 divided by 20 would give you 15 seconds. The next thing to do is focus your camera, and this is actually one of the most challenging things to do in Milky Way photography. The challenge is that the infinity mark on most lenses is not particularly accurate, and you can't trust that that will give you a sharp focus. So there are two main methods to focus to infinity for Milky Way photography. The first is to shoot at something at infinity during the daytime and take a note of where the infinity marker is compared to the mark of where the camera is focused. You can then use a pen or marker or make a mental note of where the infinity marker is so you know where infinity focus is. Then turn your autofocus off. You want to have your lens in manual focus so it doesn't try to autofocus on you while you try to take your photos. The other technique is done at night while you're getting ready to shoot your Milky Way photos. Focus at a bright star or a distant light. Make sure your lens is in manual focus. Hit the magnify button to magnify the star on your back LCD as much as you can, and then manually focus until the star is sharp. At that point, make sure you don't touch the focus knob again. Okay, welcome back. It's gotten dark out now, and the Milky Way has risen behind the church that's going to be my target. So the first thing we need to do now is set up the camera, as I mentioned earlier, to make sure we're ready to take our shots. So let's go to the back of the camera and change a few settings there to make sure we're all ready to go. Okay, now we're going to change the camera settings to make sure we're ready to take our photos. We're going to put the camera in manual mode. Then for shutter speed, I'm going to set that here to be about 20 seconds. I like it a little bit shorter than the rule of 500 to make sure my stars are really sharp. I'm going to set my aperture wide open to f1.4 right here. I'm going to put my ISO at 3200 here. Okay, now it's time to focus the camera, which can be one of the more tricky things to do. As I mentioned earlier, we'll make sure that our lens is set to manual focus and not on autofocus. I'm going to point the camera at the brightest star in the sky. I'm going to magnify using the magnify button, and I'm going to magnify on that star as brightly as I can. You see here, if I make it out of focus on both sides of the focus point, it gets larger. The trick here is to continually move it back and forth until you get the finest point that you can, and that will be the place where it is in tightest focus. For me, that's about right there. Okay, now it's time to start framing our shot. If you put on the level on your camera, it's helpful to help frame the shot because it's very difficult to know what level is in the dark. There we go, I'm level. Now I'm just going to take a test exposure and see if my framing looks appropriate. Now let's have a look at that exposure and to see what we think. There, so that looks pretty interesting. I like the composition. I like the church on the left-hand side and the core of the Milky Way on the right. You'll notice that there's a little bit of a light streaming out of the basement of the church. I actually think that adds a lot to the photo by having a little bit of a mysterious light coming out of the basement of the church. There's also a light on in the church, actually, in one of the windows, which actually adds a beautiful effect. So I think that is looking good right now. I'm going to take another exposure or two just to double check and make sure that all my shots are looking okay. And you can see here that my stars are fairly sharp. There's a little bit of streaking because on these high megapixel cameras there actually is a little bit of streaking even if you use the rule of 500. That's looking pretty good. But you will also see that the land is very dark. The land and the church are very dark. Now when we process this photo, I'll be able to raise the shadows of the land and the church. I'll lower the brightness of the sky so it matches a little bit more. You'll be able to see the Milky Way better, and that will still make a decent photo. So let's go back home and look at these on the computer. Okay, we're back home on the computer. Now this isn't going to be a detailed astrophoto processing tutorial, but I did want to give you a quick peek on what's possible. So I'm going to zip through this very, very quickly. Now this photo was shot with an f1.4 lens, which lets in maybe a lot more light than your lens might. So I'm going to reduce the exposure here just to show you what your photo might look like. It might look something like this. So let's use this as a starting point. I'm going to raise the exposure, I'm going to raise the shadows a bit so the foreground shows up a bit. LightRoom's got a wonderful new feature now where I can select the sky. After the sky is selected, I can process the sky separately, and that's a big tip for Milky Way processing, is to process the sky and the land differently because they're much different exposures. So I'm going to lower the exposure, increase the contrast, increase the clarity a bit. Not too much, it makes it look a bit crunchy when you do. I like my sky, my Milky Way photos to be a bit on the blue side, so I'm going to lower the color temperature. I'm going to dehaze this a bit, which will just cut through some of the light pollution and make the Milky Way pop out a little bit more. You can add a radial gradient here for the Milky Way section of your photo and just apply a few adjustments selectively. I'm going to increase the exposure, increase the contrast, maybe raise the whites a bit, but lower the shadows and the blacks so that the Milky Way pops out a little bit more. Of course, if you overdo any of these, it won't look very natural. So you have to use a bit of caution. I like to put a linear gradient on the top of my photo to make it a little bit darker coming from top and lightening as it goes down. I use contrast to do that and not exposure. Otherwise my stars will also get dark. I also do the same thing from the bottom. I like putting a little bit of a linear gradient on the bottom and darkening the bottom a little bit. And the church, because it's underexposed, looks a little bit flat. I'm going to add a radial gradient on the church and there raise the shadows a bit, raise the exposure a bit, maybe add a bit of warmth to give it a little bit of color, and maybe I'll add a little bit of vibrance to the photo overall, as well as add a little bit of a vignette, a very gentle one. And there you go. There's a very basic view of how you can do some processing on your Milky Way photo. I hope I gave you the tools to go out your very next outing that there's no moon and clear skies, to go out and take your first Milky Way photo. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments which of these tips help you the most, and if you've got any more questions. If you like this type of content, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.